Living in Turkey is harder than you think. In 2018, you could buy an average house in Istanbul for 440,000 lira. In 2022, that same property would cost you over 2 million, a 4.5-time increase in just 4 years. And although the minimum wage has risen, it's simply not enough. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Istanbul's city centre costs more than the average person's entire monthly salary. Housing has become so expensive, even the former head of Turkey's central bank could not afford his own house and had no choice but to move in with his parents. This isn't just a housing crisis. In 2021, nearly half of all Turkish people classified their quality of life as suffering, the highest proportion in over 15 years. 6 out of every 10 people reported not being able to afford food, standing in long lines for free bread, while bakeries themselves teeter on bankruptcy. The situation has become so bleak that Turkey's most talented people are starting to leave the country, with 3/4 of the country's youth planning on moving abroad in the near future. The government has tried to fix these problems, implementing caps on rent increases, subsidizing energy bills, and overhauling their economic plan. But none of this seems to be very effective. So how did this happen? The answer may not be what you think. Unlike other countries, Turkey's problems do not stem from the global financial crisis, or even tourists or wealthy foreigners. Instead, one powerful yet eccentric man is behind most of this: President Erdogan, whose autocratic ways and bizarre economic theory have kept the country in chaos. This is how living in Turkey became impossible. To understand how the country found itself in such a bad position, we need to first go back to the early 2000s. In 2002, Recep Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party won an astonishing landslide election victory. At the time, the country was desperately trying to recover from the 2001 Turkish economic crisis, a catastrophe that reduced the country's GDP by nearly 6% in a single year. Turkey had to pull itself back together, and Erdogan's party won on a radical vision to do just that. Their plan was ultimately pretty simple: massively cut government spending to restabilize the economy and restore investor confidence. From 2001 to 2005, the country's budget deficit fell from over 16% of GDP to just 2%. Of course, for a time this meant big cuts to things like healthcare and education, neither of which were particularly popular. But to be fair, for all their downsides, these reforms actually worked. By 2005, the country's inflation rate had dropped from over 100% to just 8%. Businesses could now plan for the future without worrying that their costs would double overnight. And crucially, it meant that foreign investors who had avoided Turkey for years suddenly started to see it as a stable, credible market. But the country also had a stroke of luck that made this golden opportunity for economic growth work. The world was entering into an era of ultra-low interest rates. During the 2000s, rates in the US dropped from over 6.5% to a historic low of around 1%. This meant that for many investors, it really didn't make much sense to keep money in the US, so instead they started looking for other places to invest. And the first country on their list? Turkey. Its prime location at the intersection between Europe and Asia gave it potential for huge economic growth, linking European consumers with Asian manufacturers, and the money started pouring in. By 2006, foreign direct investment into Turkey was averaging $10 billion a year, a tenfold increase in only 4 years. For a while, Turkey seemed to be flourishing. Between 2002 and 2007, the country's GDP grew by more than 7% every year, meaning that incomes for the average person were rising quickly. All this growth ended up spilling over into the housing market. Nationwide mortgage lending exploded from just 3 billion lira in 2003 to over 30 billion by 2007. Construction became one of the country's largest industries, employing more than 1.5 million people and contributing close to 6% of the economy. But crucially, even as prices rose, the ratio of household income to home prices stayed relatively low, meaning that for the first time in decades, ordinary Turkish families could actually afford to buy their own homes. Even when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, Turkey was miraculously one of the few countries that survived relatively unscathed. The country seemed unstoppable, but unfortunately for the emerging nation, this was about as good as things were going to get. That's because while Erdogan and the AKP had significant popularity and political power from their success in the 2000s, there was a major underlying problem. Erdogan had some pretty strange economic beliefs. Although the AKP had initially promoted seemingly orthodox economics in the early 2000s, Erdogan at heart is a fervent believer of Islamic finance. That means he effectively bases his economic approach on his own interpretations of Sharia law, even if this means doing the exact opposite of what mainstream economic theory suggests. As a former finance minister once claimed, Erdogan's approach is equivalent to burning the books of Adam Smith. Most significantly, he insists that interest rates are sinful and must be kept as low as possible, no matter what, a belief that would later prove fatal for the Turkish economy. Fortunately, for most of the 2000s and 2010s, Erdogan still lacked the right opportunity to turn his eccentric ideas into reality. But this all changed in 2017. As his own popularity grew, Erdogan gradually managed to remove the checks and balances on his power, all based on a promise that this would allow him to improve the lives of Turkish citizens even more. This meant things like taking away the independence of the central bank and replacing it with bureaucrats who shared his belief in Islamic finance. And that's when the problems started to emerge, because almost as soon as this was accomplished, the country faced a major economic hurdle. The US started to raise interest rates. By the end of 2018, rates had risen back up to 2.5%, which might not sound like a lot, but it translated to an increase of over 5 times in just a couple years. For Turkey, this was disastrous. The country had become dependent on huge amounts of foreign investment to keep the economy running. But now those investors can make the same returns in the US on much less risky investments. So instead, they simply started pulling their money out of the country. In just 1 year, Turkey experienced a net loss of $8.7 billion, a crushing blow to the country's economy. One of the first sectors to feel the hit was housing. Between 2017 and 2018, new home sales dropped by almost 20%, while construction growth, which had been running at double digits throughout the 2000s, fell to nearly zero. The entire industry had been built upon cheap foreign credit, but when that money dried up, the industry quickly slowed to a halt. For ordinary people, this was devastating. Families who had taken on mortgages during the boom suddenly found themselves with debts they could no longer afford, while for construction workers, nearly 2 million of them nationwide faced mass layoffs as projects were frozen or abandoned. With all that said, there was an even bigger problem looming ahead, a currency crisis. For the foreign investors looking to sell their assets and get out of Turkey, they also had to exchange their lira for other foreign currencies. What this meant is that the foreign exchange market for lira was suddenly flooded with the Turkish currency, causing the price of the lira to collapse. Within just a couple months, the currency had lost over a third of its value. Now, under normal circumstances, this might not be a huge issue. After all, a cheaper currency makes it far easier to sell products on the global market, often actually boosting an economy. But it can also create some problems. A depreciating currency makes imports more expensive, which for a country like Turkey, which was importing a large amount of food and other household goods, caused a real issue. Of course, in this case, a normal government would simply raise interest rates to counteract the higher rates of inflation. But Erdogan, based on his belief in Islamic finance, did the exact opposite. Instead, he forced the interest rates even lower, eventually pushing them down to near zero levels. He even publicly proclaimed that interest rates were the mother of all evil, and praised his own methods as the real way to combat inflation. Of course, this totally failed. The Turkish lira depreciated even further, plummeting to a record low of 6.95 against the dollar in August of that year. Prices of food, beverages, utilities, and household goods exploded, and by the end of 2018, the inflation rate had more than doubled. While the central bank eventually hiked interest rates back up in a desperate attempt to reverse these effects, it was to little or no avail. Without anticipating it, Erdoganomics had set off a feedback loop that would cripple the Turkish economy for years to come. By 2024, the value of the lira had been reduced by almost 6 times from its peak, and at some points prices were rising at over 85% every year. And all of this chaos caused yet another crisis. The prices of homes exploded. In just 2 years, the average price of a home in Istanbul tripled. At its peak, prices were increasing by over 205% every year. Renters were hit just as hard, with average rents across the country rising by more than 150% in 2022 alone. Surveys found that over 60% of Turkish households were spending more than half of their monthly income just to keep a roof above their heads. And home ownership, once an attainable middle-class goal, suddenly became almost impossible for young families. And while wages were climbing during this inflation period, it wasn't nearly by as fast as inflation, leaving workers unable to keep up with soaring rents. This was then only made worse when a set of major earthquakes hit Turkey in 2023, destroying over 700,000 houses in a matter of days. Almost 2 years later, over 500,000 people are still living in makeshift container homes, and reconstruction costs are estimated to be a staggering 88 billion, equal to about 10% of the country's GDP. This combination of high levels of inflation and exploding house prices has led to an economy which for the vast majority of people is totally unlivable. The result? People are simply leaving. Nearly 3/4 of Turkey's youth plan a future abroad. And in a similar vein, over 14,000 doctors, unable to live on their wages, have already moved to other countries, further depleting Turkey's already strained healthcare system. The entire country's economic future could be jeopardized. The industries that are losing the most young professionals are communication technologies, engineering and education, the things that are arguably the most important for the future of the country's economy. And to make matters worse, this brain drain is already starting to scare off foreign investors. Surveys from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development show that more than half of foreign firms now rank political instability and a lack of skilled workers as the main resources for reducing exposure to Turkey. For a country that has long depended on foreign capital to fund growth, losing both its brightest minds and the confidence of outside investors creates a vicious cycle. The loss of skilled workers makes Turkey less attractive to foreign capital, and the lack of investment in turn makes it harder to create the kind of jobs and opportunities that would convince young people to stay, and only slowly decline into the teens by 2027. So even if investors do return, the domestic economy will remain under extreme pressure. In some senses, the story of the Turkish economy is a pretty cruel twist of irony. When Erdogan first came to power in the early 2000s, his great political success was restoring investor confidence and attracting billions of dollars in foreign capital. But 2 decades later, his own unorthodox economic policies, from undermining the central bank to denying interest rate hikes, have not only driven that money away, but also helped push out the very generation of workers needed to rebuild the economy. Today, Turkey is still reeling from the effects of several dark, chaotic years, and its current state is the culmination of political instability, economic confusion, and poor long-term planning. While Turkey has since reversed its economic approach, it has not fully reversed what happened to its people. The average Turkish person today is grappling with stubbornly high costs of finding housing and affording basic groceries, all against a backdrop of political scandals and protests erupting in the country. In the end, Turkey's story is increasingly one of wasted potential. A country that once stood as the rising star of emerging markets is now struggling just to keep its people fed and housed. Reforms may eventually bring inflation under control, but the damage to trust, talent, and investment will take far longer to repair. Until then, living in Turkey will remain, for millions of its citizens, close to impossible. Gold is trading at all-time highs, far beyond even the boldest forecasts for 2025. Precious metals are the story of the year, and central banks are buying record amounts, and gold and silver are leading all major asset classes. This isn't happening in isolation. Tariffs, wars, and crushing sovereign debt are reshaping global trade, with China and Russia pushing to bypass the US dollar. We're entering a volatile era where the financial order itself is being rewritten. And gold's surge isn't just another bull run. The way investors access and hold it is facing a revolution, like Netflix and Blockbuster. ETFs made gold accessible in the 2000s, but they're plagued with flaws. Shaky audits, questionable backing, high fees, and limited availability worldwide. That gap has created the opening for a challenger. That's where Streamex, ticker symbol STEX on the NASDAQ, the sponsor of today's video, comes in. Streamex is aiming to disrupt the gold ETF model entirely by offering products that are fully backed, vaulted, audited, verified, and yield-bearing, accessible to investors across the globe. Billionaire mining tycoon Frank Giustra clearly sees the opportunity. He owns 17 million shares, a stake worth around $90 million, and alongside him is mining legend Sean Roosen, both bringing heavyweight credibility to this project. StreamX wants to do to commodities ETFs what Netflix did to movies and Apple did to music. They're set to dramatically improve the user experience by addressing every weakness ETFs currently have. No more doubts about whether the gold exists. No more questions about audits. No more management fees that cut into your returns. and most importantly, accessibility for hundreds of millions of investors who have been shut off until now. Their first product, a fully backed, yield-bearing gold offering, is on the verge of launch, and this isn't just theory. StreamX has secured up to $1.1 billion in funding through Cantor Fitzgerald. That gives them the capital to actually purchase physical gold and hold it in their balance sheet, something most ETFs don't do. Their proprietary platform is built by the same engineers who developed cybersecurity infrastructure for JP Morgan, Capital One, and Bank of America, so the backbone is as solid as it gets. StreamX tokenized gold will be launched on Solana and Coinbase's Base blockchain. Tokenization of real-world assets is seen as the biggest financial disruption of our time, enabling 24/7 trading on a global scale. While most major financial institutions are scrambling to adapt, StreamX is already positioned to lead, and it's not stopping at gold. The company plans to expand into silver and other commodities, building a suite of products that could fundamentally change how investors gain exposure to the resource sector. For years, critics like Warren Buffett have dismissed gold because it doesn't generate yield, but StreamX is flipping that script. Through a partnership with Monetary Metals, they've designed a gold product that pays yield to its holders. You're no longer just storing wealth, you're earning on it. With Geostra's massive stake, $1.1 billion in financing, audited backing, and cutting-edge infrastructure, StreamX looks set to become one of the most important disruptors in commodities finance. Do your own research, but I believe this is a Netflix versus Blockbuster moment for gold, and StreamX, STEX on the NASDAQ, sits at the very center of it.